March 7th, 1945, dawned cold and gray over the muddy banks of the Rhine River as Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell watched his men unload the strangest vehicles he had ever seen in TWO years of combat. The massive boat-like trucks sat on 6 wheels, their hulls gleaming with fresh olive-drab paint, looking like some mad inventor's dream of what would happen if a truck mated with a landing craft. "What in God's name are those things, Colonel?" asked Sergeant Tommy O'Brien, spitting tobacco juice into the German mud as he stared at the peculiar machines being rolled off the transport trucks. Mitchell consulted his classified briefing papers, still finding it hard to believe what he was reading. "They're called DUKWs, Sergeant. DUKWs, amphibious trucks that can drive on land and sail on water, and they're going to help us cross that river without the Germans knowing what hit them." The Rhine stretched before them like a natural fortress, its dark waters carrying chunks of ice and debris from the spring thaw. On the far shore, German defensive positions bristled with artillery pieces, machine gun nests, and anti-tank guns. General Walter Model's Army Group B had turned every building, every hill, every crossroads into a killing field. For months, the Wehrmacht had been preparing for this moment, the inevitable Allied crossing of Germany's greatest natural barrier. But what the German defenders didn't know, what their intelligence reports had completely missed, was that the Americans possessed a secret weapon that could turn their carefully planned defensive strategy upside down. The DUKW, officially designated as a truck, amphibious, 2.5-ton, 6x6, was about to change the nature of river crossing operations forever. Staff Sergeant Mike Romano ran his weathered hands along the hull of his assigned Duck, marveling at the engineering genius that had created this hybrid monster. Born from a marriage between a standard General Motors Corporation truck chassis and a boat hull designed by yacht architects, the DUKW could carry 25 fully equipped soldiers or 5,000 pounds of supplies across water, then drive directly onto land without missing a beat. "My old man worked the docks in Brooklyn," Romano told his squad as they familiarized themselves with their new ride. "He always said boats belong in water and trucks belong on land. Never thought I'd see the day when somebody mixed them together." The men of the 7th Armored Division had been training with these amphibious vehicles for 3 weeks at a secret facility near Reims, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of using them in combat. According to reports from the Pacific Theater, referenced in classified military communications obtained from the National Archives, DUKWs had already proven their worth in island-hopping campaigns against the Japanese, but this would be their first major use in the European theater. As evening fell over the Rhine Valley, Mitchell gathered his company commanders for a final briefing. Tomorrow, they would launch Operation Varsity, the largest airborne operation since D-Day, combined with a massive river crossing that would punch through German defenses and open the road to Berlin. The Germans expected landing craft, pontoon bridges, and conventional alt boats. They had no idea that American ingenuity had produced a vehicle that could drive up to the water's edge, splash into the river like a duck taking flight, and emerge on the other side still rolling. The cold morning air of March 8th carried the acrid smell of cordite and diesel fuel as Oberst Hans Richter surveyed his defensive positions along the eastern bank of the Rhine. From his command bunker carved into the hillside near Wesel, the veteran Wehrmacht officer could see for miles across the flat German countryside, every field of fire carefully calculated, every approach route covered by interlocking zones of destruction. Richter had fought on every front of this war, Poland, France, Russia, and now the desperate defense of the fatherland itself. His 63rd Corps had been bloodied but not broken during the retreat across Western Europe, and he had used every lesson learned in 4 years of combat to prepare his defenses. Anti-tank guns positioned in concealed bunkers, machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire, and artillery pieces registered on every possible landing site along the riverbank. "Herr Oberst, The American artillery barrage has been going on for 6 hours, reported Major Wilhelm Steinbach, his operations officer, ducking as another salvo of American shells screamed overhead. Our spotters report massive concentrations of landing craft being moved into position on the western shore. Richter nodded grimly, studying the tactical map spread before him. Intelligence reports from Army Group B headquarters indicated that the Americans were preparing a conventional river crossing operation, probably using the same assault boat tactics they had employed at the Rhine crossings further south. His defensive plan was designed specifically to counter such an attack. Concentrated artillery fire on the crossing points, followed by machine gun and anti-tank fire as the Americans attempted to establish a foothold on the eastern shore. What Richter and his staff didn't know was that American military engineers had been working since 1941 to develop an entirely new type of amphibious vehicle. The DUKW program, originally conceived by the National Defense Research Committee and developed by the Radiation Laboratory at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had produced a weapon that would completely bypass traditional river crossing vulnerabilities. Feldwebel Kurt Weber crouched in his machine gun position, watching the western shore through his binoculars as American artillery continued to pound German defensive positions. The 23-year-old veteran from Bavaria had survived the nightmare of the Eastern Front before being transferred west, and he knew the sound of impending attack. The Americans were preparing something big. He could feel it in his bones. "They'll come at dawn," Weber told his gunner, a young replacement named Fritz Muller, who had arrived just 2 weeks earlier. "Same as always. Landing craft full of infantry trying to get across before we can bring our guns to bear. We'll be ready for them." But Weber's expectations, like those of every German defender along the Rhine, were based on conventional warfare doctrine. None of them had ever seen or heard of a vehicle that could drive like a truck on land, then transform into a boat on water, carrying a full squad of infantry and their equipment across the river without need for separate landing craft or engineers to build pontoon bridges. In the German intelligence files, captured from various sources and referenced in post-war military analysis by the United States Army Center of Military History, there was no mention of amphibious trucks. German military doctrine assumed that river crossings required vulnerable boats that could be destroyed by concentrated fire during the crossing, leaving attacking infantry stranded in the middle of the river. As night fell on March 8th, Richter made his final preparations for the coming assault. Every gun was loaded, every position manned, every sector of fire carefully coordinated. His experienced Wehrmacht soldiers had been fighting the Western Allies for nearly a year, and they knew how Americans fought, with overwhelming firepower followed by massed infantry attacks using predictable tactics. Tomorrow morning, they would learn that American ingenuity had produced something entirely outside their experience, a weapon that would render many of their carefully prepared defenses useless and open a new chapter in the art of amphibious warfare. March 9, 1945, brought a pre-dawn darkness thick with mist rising from the Rhine's cold waters as Lieutenant Michael Patterson crouched beside his DUKW, checking his equipment one final time. The 24-year-old officer from Ohio had graduated from West Point just 2 years earlier, but the war had aged him far beyond his years. This morning, he would lead the first wave of DUKWs across the Rhine, in what would become one of the most innovative amphibious operations of World War II. "Remember, boys," Patterson whispered to his squad as they climbed into the strange-looking vehicle, "we go in fast and quiet. No engine noise until we hit the water, then full throttle to the other side. The Krauts won't know what hit them until we're already driving up their beach." The DUKW's unique design allowed it to approach the water's edge like any ordinary truck, then seamlessly transition into a watercraft without stopping. Staff Sergeant Romano engaged the propeller drive as the vehicle's wheels left solid ground and entered the Rhine's current. Behind them, dozens of other DUKWs followed in precise formation, each carrying 25 fully equipped soldiers of the 79th Infantry Division, On the German side of the river, Feldwebel-Weber strained his eyes through the morning mist, trying to identify the source of the strange engine sounds coming from across the water. The noise was different from the usual landing craft engines, deeper, more mechanical, like heavy trucks rather than boats. "Fritz, do you see anything?" Weber asked his assistant gunner, who was scanning the river through his rifle scope. "Nothing clear, Feldwebel. The mist is too thick. But I can hear engines, lots of them." What Weber couldn't see was a revolutionary moment in military history unfolding before him. The DUKWs, invisible in the dawn mist, were crossing the Rhine at 15 different points simultaneously, each vehicle carrying enough firepower and personnel to establish an immediate foothold on the eastern shore. Unlike conventional landing craft, which required separate transport to and from ships offshore, these amphibious trucks had driven directly from supply depots miles behind the lines, loaded with ammunition, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, coordinating the assault from his command, DUKW, watched with professional satisfaction as his plan unfolded. According to official records from the United States Army Transportation Corps, later archived in the National Archives and Records Administration, the DUKW had originally been developed for Pacific theater operations where traditional landing craft proved inadequate for certain types of beach assaults. Now, that same innovative thinking was about to break open the Western Front. "Contact shore in 30 seconds, Romano called back to Patterson's squad. The DUKW's hull cut through the Rhine's current like a knife, its powerful engine driving the propeller at maximum efficiency. Around them, other DUKWs maintained formation, their hulls barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. As the first DUKW reached the eastern shore, something unprecedented in military history occurred. An amphibious vehicle drove directly from water onto land without pause, its wheels finding purchase on the muddy bank as its propeller automatically disengaged and truck transmission re-engaged. Patterson's squad was ashore and moving before the German defenders fully understood what they were seeing. "Amerikanische Panzer!" shouted a German sentry, mistaking the DUKWs for some kind of armored vehicle. The confusion was understandable. No German soldier had ever seen anything like these hybrid machines that seemed to violate the basic laws of military logistics. Within minutes, 25 DUKWs had established a beachhead 300 yards deep along a 2-mile front. Instead of vulnerable infantry struggling ashore from conventional landing craft, the Germans faced fully equipped American soldiers who had crossed the river with all their heavy weapons, ammunition, and radio equipment intact and ready for immediate action. Oberst Richter, monitoring the situation from his command bunker, found himself facing a tactical problem that didn't exist in any Wehrmacht training manual. The confusion in the German ranks reached critical levels as Oberst Richter tried to make sense of the contradictory reports flooding his command center. Machine gunners reported vehicles that seemed to be both boats and trucks simultaneously. Artillery spotters claimed to see wheeled vehicles emerging from the Rhine like some kind of mechanical sea monsters. Radio operators frantically relayed messages that made no tactical sense according to conventional military doctrine. "Herr Oberst, the Americans have established multiple beachheads, but our observers cannot determine how they crossed the river," Major Steinbach reported, his voice tight with confusion. "There are no landing craft visible on the water, no pontoon bridges, no assault boats. Yet they continue to bring heavy equipment and reinforcements across at an impossible rate." Richter studied the tactical map with growing concern. In 30 years of military service, he had never encountered a situation quite like this. The Americans seemed to possess some kind of technology that allowed them to bypass the fundamental challenges of river-crossing operations. Traditional defensive doctrine assumed that attacking forces would be vulnerable during the water-crossing phase, when boats could be targeted by concentrated artillery and machine gun fire. But these strange American vehicles appeared and disappeared into the morning mist like ghosts. Meanwhile, on the American side of the operation, the DUKWs continued their revolutionary demonstration of amphibious warfare capabilities. Technical Sergeant Robert "Tank" Johnson, a former Detroit auto worker turned military engineer, marveled at the smooth operation of his assigned duck as it made its third crossing of the morning, this time loaded with anti-tank guns and ammunition. "You know what this reminds me of?" Johnson called to his crew as they approached the German shore. "Back home, we had these tour boats on Lake Michigan that could drive right up onto the beach to load passengers. Never thought I'd see the U.S. Army build something similar, but bigger and meaner." The DUKW's revolutionary design incorporated lessons learned from both automotive and marine engineering. According to technical documentation later published by the Society of Automotive Engineers and referenced in post-war military analysis, the vehicle's unique hull shape provided stability in water while maintaining the ground clearance and mobility of a standard military truck. The transition between land and water operation was accomplished through an ingenious transmission system that could engage either wheels or propeller depending on the terrain. By 1000 hours, the German defensive line along the Rhine had been penetrated at 15 separate points, with American forces continuing to pour across the river in a steady stream of men and material. What made the situation particularly confusing for German commanders was that their pre-registered artillery concentrations, designed to destroy conventional landing craft during river crossings, proved ineffective against targets that spent minimal time in the water and could maneuver independently once ashore. Feldwebel Weber, still manning his machine gun position, watched in amazement as another group of the strange American vehicles emerged from the Rhine and immediately began moving inland like conventional trucks. His training had taught him to concentrate fire on landing craft during their most vulnerable phase, the transition from water to land. But these American machines completed that transition in seconds, not minutes, giving him no opportunity to bring effective fire to bear. "It's like they've reinvented warfare," Weber muttered to his assistant gunner. "How do you fight an enemy who can ignore the basic rules of military logistics?" The psychological impact on German defenders was perhaps as significant as the tactical advantage gained by the Americans. According to post-war interviews conducted by military historians and archived in the United States Army Military History Institute, many German soldiers reported feeling that they were facing some kind of supernatural or science-fictional enemy. The sight of wheeled vehicles emerging from rivers violated their fundamental understanding of how military equipment functioned. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, coordinating the assault from his floating command post, radioed back to division headquarters with a status report that would become part of military legend. Operation proceeding ahead of schedule. Enemy resistance disorganized and confused. The Ducks are performing beyond all expectations. Recommend immediate exploitation of breakthrough. By noon on March 9th, the tactical situation along the Rhine had transformed into something unprecedented in military history. American forces had established 17 separate bridgeheads across a 20-mile front, each one supplied and reinforced by the continuous stream of DUKWs crossing the river with apparent impunity. What had begun as an innovative amphibious assault was rapidly becoming a complete collapse of German defensive doctrine. General Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, arrived at Oberst Richter's headquarters to assess the crisis personally. The veteran Wehrmacht commander, who had earned his reputation as a defensive genius on the Eastern Front, found himself confronting a tactical problem that challenged every assumption about river crossing operations. "Show me exactly what we're facing," Model demanded, studying the situation map where red arrows indicated American penetrations scattered across the entire front. "How are they maintaining such rapid reinforcement without visible supply lines?" Richter pointed to the latest reconnaissance reports, his voice strained with frustration. "Herr General, our observers report that the Americans possess some type of amphibious vehicle that operates as both truck and boat. They can cross the river independently, without need for engineers to construct bridges or landing craft to transport troops. Each vehicle carries a full squad of infantry plus heavy weapons and supplies." Model examined the reports with the eye of a professional soldier who had seen every innovation in military technology during 5 years of warfare. The implications were staggering. If the Americans could cross rivers without the traditional vulnerabilities associated with amphibious operations, then the entire German strategy of using natural barriers for defense had been rendered obsolete. On the American side, the success of the DUKW operations was exceeding even the most optimistic projections. Major General William Simpson, commanding the Ninth Army, watched from his observation post as the strange-looking vehicles continued their relentless shuttle service across the Rhine. According to official records from the United States Army Center of Military History, later archived in the National Archives, Simpson reported to higher headquarters that the DUKWs had achieved something no previous amphibious operation had managed, a sustained river crossing with 0 casualties during the water phase of the assault. Captain David Washington, a former merchant marine officer from San Francisco who had been assigned to train DUKW operators, found himself in the unique position of commanding a revolutionary new type of military unit. His amphibious truck company was writing the book on a completely new form of combined arms operations where the traditional distinctions between land and naval warfare had been eliminated. What we're doing here today is going to change military thinking for generations, Washington told his assembled drivers and crew chiefs. These machines represent a fundamental shift in how armies move and fight. We're not just crossing a river. We're proving that American industrial innovation can overcome any obstacle the enemy puts in our way. The technical success of the DUKW crossing operations was matched by their psychological impact on both American and German forces. American soldiers, initially skeptical of the strange-looking vehicles, quickly developed confidence in their capabilities. German defenders, on the other hand, found their carefully prepared defensive positions bypassed by an enemy who seemed to possess almost magical abilities to appear wherever needed. Staff Sergeant Romano, now on his 5th crossing of the day, had developed an almost affectionate relationship with his DUKW. "This ugly duck has carried 200 men and 10 tons of supplies across that river today," he told a war correspondent who had hitched a ride during one of the crossings. "Yesterday, the Germans thought the Rhine was their greatest defensive asset. Today, it's just another road for the U.S. Army to drive across." The strategic implications of the DUKW breakthrough extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. German military planners had based their entire defensive strategy on the assumption that natural obstacles like rivers would force Allied armies to concentrate their forces at predictable crossing points where German artillery and defensive positions could exact maximum casualties. The ability to cross rivers at multiple points simultaneously, without advance preparation or vulnerable supply lines, fundamentally altered the strategic equation. By 1500 hours, advanced elements of the American forces had penetrated 15 miles inland from the Rhine, moving faster than German reserves could respond to the multiple breakthrough points. The war in Western Europe had entered its final phase, and the DUKW had played a crucial role in breaking the back of German resistance. The story of how the DUKW came to revolutionize amphibious warfare reached back to 1941, when American military planners first recognized the need for a vehicle that could operate effectively on both land and water. In a conference room at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a group of civilian engineers and military officers had envisioned exactly the scenario now playing out on the Rhine: the need to move men and supplies across water barriers without the traditional vulnerabilities of amphibious operations. Dennis Puliston, a yacht designer from Connecticut, had worked with Rod Stevens Jr. and Frank Spire to create the hull design that would become the DUKW's most revolutionary feature. Their concept was elegantly simple: combine a proven truck chassis with a seaworthy boat hull, creating a vehicle that could transition seamlessly between land and water operation without compromising either capability. General Motors Corporation had accepted the engineering challenge of making this concept reality, modifying their standard 6x6 truck design to accommodate the Marine. Requirements. According to engineering reports archived by the Society of Automotive Engineers and referenced in post-war technical analyses, The most difficult problem had been creating a transmission system that could power both wheels and propeller without mechanical interference or loss of efficiency. As the DUKWs continued their crossing operations on March 9, 1945, they were demonstrating the payoff from 4 years of intensive development and testing. The vehicles that seemed so strange to German observers represented the cutting edge of American industrial innovation, embodying the same spirit of practical problem-solving that had built the American economy into the world's most productive manufacturing base. Colonel Mitchell, now coordinating supply operations from a forward command post on the German side of the Rhine, marveled at the logistics revolution taking place before his eyes. Traditional river crossing operations required extensive advanced planning, specialized equipment, and vulnerable supply lines that could be disrupted by enemy action. The DUKW system eliminated most of those vulnerabilities by making each vehicle self-sufficient for the crossing phase of operations. What we're seeing here is more than just a new type of truck, Mitchell explained to a group of visiting staff officers from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. This represents a fundamental change in how armies think about mobility and logistics. When you can drive supplies directly from depots miles behind the front lines to combat units on the other side of a major river barrier, you've eliminated one of the oldest constraints in military operations. The psychological impact on German forces continued to grow throughout the afternoon as reports of the strange American vehicles spread through Wehrmacht communications networks. Soldiers who had never seen anything like the DUKWs described them in terms that seemed almost fantastical to higher commanders trying to assess the tactical situation. Major Wilhelm Steinbach, processing intelligence reports from frontline units, found himself writing situation reports that read like science fiction rather than military analysis. American forces continue to employ amphibious trucks that can operate independently in water and on land. These vehicles appear capable of crossing rivers without support from engineer units or naval elements. Estimated capability: 25 personnel or equivalent cargo per vehicle, with unlimited crossing capacity, limited only by vehicle availability. The broader implications of the DUKW's success extended beyond the immediate military situation to encompass questions about the future of warfare itself. If American industry could produce vehicles that seemed to violate basic assumptions about military logistics, what other innovations might emerge from the marriage of civilian technology and military requirements? The German military-industrial complex, stretched to breaking point after 4 years of total war, had focused on perfecting existing weapons systems rather than developing revolutionary new concepts. The DUKW represented a fundamentally different approach to military innovation: the application of civilian engineering expertise to solve military problems that traditional military thinking had considered insoluble. By 1800 hours on March 9th, the Rhine crossing had become a logistical conveyor belt, with DUKWs maintaining a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies to the expanding American bridgeheads. What had begun as an experimental use of an innovative vehicle had become a demonstration of American industrial and military superiority that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The success of the DUKW crossing operations came at a human cost that extended far beyond simple casualty statistics, touching the lives of soldiers on both sides of the Rhine in ways that would resonate long after the war's end. For the American forces, the strange amphibious vehicles represented hope, proof that American ingenuity and industrial might could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. For German defenders, they symbolized the technological superiority that made their cause increasingly hopeless. Feldwebel Kurt Weber, still manning his machine gun position despite the obvious collapse of the defensive line around him, watched another group of DUKWs emerge from the Rhine with a mixture of professional admiration and personal despair. The 23-year-old veteran had fought from the gates of Moscow to the beaches of Normandy, but he had never encountered an enemy who seemed to possess such overwhelming technological advantages. "Fritz, gather the remaining ammunition. Weber ordered his assistant gunner. "We'll hold this position as long as possible, then fall back to the secondary line." But Weber knew, with the fatalism of a soldier who had seen too much combat, that there would be no effective secondary line against an enemy who could appear anywhere along hundreds of miles of riverfront. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of river crossing operations, and no amount of German courage or tactical skill could compensate for that technological breakthrough. On the American side, the human dimension of the DUKW operations was more complex than simple triumph. Technical Sergeant Johnson, completing his 7th crossing of the day, felt the weight of historical significance in what he was experiencing. The former Detroit auto worker understood, perhaps better than most soldiers, the industrial and engineering achievement represented by the ungainly vehicle that had become his second home. "You know what this reminds me of?" Johnson told his crew as they loaded wounded German prisoners for transport back across the Rhine. "Back in Detroit, when the first assembly line started producing cars fast enough to change everything about how people lived, these ducks are doing the same thing for warfare, changing the basic rules about what's possible." The medical evacuation capabilities of the DUKWs added another dimension to their revolutionary impact on military operations. Traditional river crossing operations required wounded soldiers to be transported back across water barriers using the same vulnerable landing craft that had brought assault troops forward. The DUKW's dual capabilities meant that casualty evacuation could proceed continuously, without interrupting the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Captain Washington, whose amphibious truck company had become the subject of intense interest from military observers, found himself documenting lessons learned that would influence amphibious warfare doctrine for generations. According to his after-action reports, later archived by the United States Army Transportation Corps and referenced in post-war military studies, the DUKW had achieved something unprecedented in military history: an amphibious operation with 0 casualties during the water crossing phase. The human stories emerging from the Rhine crossing operations reflected both the triumph and tragedy of modern warfare. American soldiers, initially skeptical of the strange-looking vehicles, had developed an almost superstitious confidence in their capabilities. German soldiers, facing an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural abilities to appear and disappear across water barriers, experienced a demoralization that went beyond simple tactical defeat. Lieutenant Patterson, leading his squad in their 8th crossing of the day, reflected on the broader meaning of what they were accomplishing. The young officer from Ohio had studied military history at West Point, and he understood that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself. "This isn't just about crossing a river," Patterson explained to his men as they loaded supplies for another trip across the Rhine. "We're proving that American industry can solve any problem the enemy throws at us. Every time we drive one of these ducks from land into water and back to land, we're showing the world that American innovation can overcome any obstacle." The psychological impact on German civilian populations, as reports of the strange American vehicles spread through Wehrmacht communications networks, added another layer to the human dimension of the operation. For German civilians already demoralized by years of strategic bombing and military defeats, news that the Americans possessed vehicles that could ignore natural barriers like rivers suggested that resistance was futile. Major Steinbach, compiling intelligence reports for higher headquarters, found himself documenting not just tactical information, but a fundamental shift in military psychology. The DUKW represented more than just a new weapon system. It embodied American industrial and technological superiority in a form that even ordinary soldiers could understand and appreciate. As darkness fell on March 9, 1945, the human cost of the DUKW operations extended far beyond battlefield casualties to encompass a transformation in how both sides viewed the war itself. The morning of March 10, 1945, dawned clear and cold over the Rhine Valley, revealing the full scope of the transformation that had occurred in less than 24 hours. Where German defensive positions had once commanded every approach to the river, American forces now moved freely across multiple bridgeheads, supplied by the continuous stream of DUKWs that had made the impossible routine. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, arrived at the Rhine crossing site to witness personally the revolutionary amphibious operation that was accelerating the collapse of Germ and resistance. Standing on the eastern bank of the river that had been considered Germany's greatest natural defense, Eisenhower watched DUKW after DUKW emerge from the water like mechanical sea creatures, each one carrying the men and materials that would end the war in Europe. "What you've accomplished here represents more than just a successful river crossing," Eisenhower told the assembled officers and men of the units involved in the operation. "You've demonstrated that American innovation and determination can overcome any obstacle the enemy places in our path. These amphibious vehicles have opened the road to Berlin." The strategic impact of the DUKW crossing operations extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. General Walter Model, recognizing that his defensive strategy had been fundamentally compromised by American technological superiority, authorized a general withdrawal of Army Group B to defensive positions 50 miles east of the Rhine. For the first time since the Normandy breakout, German forces were retreating without conducting a fighting withdrawal, acknowledging that they lacked the means to counter American amphibious capabilities. Staff Sergeant Romano, promoted to technical sergeant in recognition of his role in the crossing operations, found himself training new DUKW operators for the final push toward Berlin. The veteran soldier from Brooklyn had become something of a legend among amphibious vehicle crews, and his practical wisdom about operating the strange machines was being incorporated into official training manuals. "The thing about these ducks," Romano explained to a group of replacement drivers, "is that they make you think differently about what's possible. Yesterday, a river was an obstacle that required engineers, boats, and a lot of courage to cross under fire. Today, a river is just another road. That's the kind of thinking that wins wars." The technical lessons learned from the Rhine crossing operations would influence military vehicle development for decades to come. According to post-war analysis by the United States Army Ordnance Corps, referenced in official military histories archived at the National Archives, the DUKW had proven that amphibious vehicles could provide capabilities that no combination of conventional trucks and boats could match. The seamless transition between land and water operation had eliminated the most vulnerable phase of traditional river crossing operations, the period when troops and supplies were exposed to enemy fire while transferring between different types of vehicles. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, now commanding a provisional amphibious group composed entirely of DUKW units, received orders to prepare for river crossing operations along the Elbe River, the final water barrier before Berlin. The success of the Rhine crossing had convinced higher commanders that amphibious trucks could accelerate the war's end by eliminating German ability to use rivers as defensive positions. The human dimension of the DUKW legacy was perhaps most evident in the letters that American soldiers wrote home about their experiences with the revolutionary vehicles. According to correspondence archived by the National World War II Museum and referenced in post-war oral history projects, soldiers consistently expressed amazement at American industrial capability and pride in being part of operations that seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare. Captain Washington, whose amphibious truck company had become the model for DUKW operations throughout the European theater, found himself reassigned to the Pacific theater, where the vehicle's capabilities would be tested in different conditions against Japanese defensive positions. The lessons learned on the Rhine would be applied to island-hopping operations that would bring the war against Japan to its conclusion. The German perspective on the DUKW operations was captured in post-war interviews conducted by Allied intelligence officers. Oberst Richter, taken prisoner during the general withdrawal from the Rhine, acknowledged that the American amphibious vehicles had rendered traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. We prepared for the kind of river crossing operation that had been used since ancient times, Richter explained. The Americans showed us that warfare had entered a new age, where technology could overcome any natural obstacle. As the war in Europe entered its final phase, the DUKW crossing of the Rhine would be remembered as more than just a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial innovation over traditional military thinking, proving that civilian engineering expertise could solve problems that professional soldiers had considered insoluble. The ugly, ungainly vehicles that had seemed so strange to observers on both sides of the river had written a new chapter in military history, demonstrating that American ingenuity could indeed overcome any obstacle the enemy placed in the path to victory. The legacy of that cold morning in March, 1945, when strange amphibious trucks first emerged from the Rhine River, would influence military thinking long after the last shot of World War II had been fired.